Total War Warhammer 3 Tides of Torment DLC just launched, introducing 3 new legendary lords and a host of new units to play with. There are some favourites from the Games Workshop model range finally in the game, such as the Merworm, Praeton, and Cursed Ettins. Seeing the units in Total War is a huge reason for many of my model purchases. However, what happens when a Warhammer video game includes units that Games Workshop never made for the tabletop? Well, we make them ourselves, of course. I'm Jord. Welcome to my Realm Forge. Their base is probably a good place to start. After some in-game investigation, I found that these are probably the perfect base sizes. Same as dragons for the Sea Elemental, and same as trolls for the Oceanids. But these completely different, smaller, rounder bases are more important for the moment. Using a pin vise, we are going to create 3 small holes, roughly equidistant around the diameter of the bases, so that way we can embed the wire into them, which will create the spines of our Oceanids. So I decided, fairly arbitrarily, that each spine is going to be 6 inches long, so I'm going to cut off 6 inches of armature wire for each of those spines. So I carefully insert the wire, flatten the short end, and lever the long part over the rim of the base. And I do that with all 3 holes until I have something that looks a bit like this. And after some time of trying to find a suitable width of tube, I actually realised I'm better off just bundling a bunch of offcuts of foam board together, and then wrapping the wire around that. So by bundling them together with some rubber bands, it keeps them all together, and then I can put the base on one end and then twist the wires around it, and that's how I can get a nice spiral. Now it's time to get out probably the most common of all crafting materials, cling film. It's mostly used for crafting sandwiches, but we'll use it here too. If you're American, you may also know this as shrink wrap. I have no idea why it would be called that. It seems like nonsense to me, but anyway. So as you can see, we have rolled our bundle along to wrap it up, and we are cutting it free with a scalpel so we get nice clean edges. And that should hold all the wires in place once we've removed the core. Some minor adjustments may be necessary. And finally I can tell my partner that no, the heat gun isn't a waste of money. I needed it for projects. And now, using the lowest setting, I can blast the cling film wrapped around the spiral with heat, which will make it shrink, which I'm pretty sure I discovered. It's a little bit wonky, but I think it's pretty good. So what's useful with this technique is you can then repose the whole thing once you have that big tube, because it'll stop the wire from, slipping around all over the place. So you can repose it, it'll kink the cling film so you won't get those smooth edges anymore, but there's no reason why you can't just rewrap it and then blast it with a heat gun again. So there's actually no reason not to just keep reposing it. And if some of the wire being held in place is being held in a place you don't want it to be, you can always just cut the cling film away from the wire, because it's cling film, it's not difficult to cut through. Though that particular sea elemental turned out far too short, so I ended up throwing it away and making this one instead. So the next 3 steps are basically the same, but they all follow a trend. So the first step we're doing is a layer of Mod Podge and gesso. This will adhere to the cling film and allow any other layer we put on top of it to cling to that. So it gives a little in-between between the non-stick thing and whatever we wish to stick to these models. Using coloured gesso also allows us to be able to tell if there are any bubbles in it. They will start displaying now that it's not all transparent, so we can cut those out with a craft knife, and any holes that are formed either from the heat tearing the cling film or from the craft knife, we're going to papier-mâché over by just using tissue paper and the same mix we've been priming with. I'm then going to follow it up with a couple layers of just straight up papier-mâché. Once each layer has dried, because we want this to be quite a hard shell, because we are going to be adding sculptural elements onto the top. I need to be able to work putty into this stuff without the whole spiral buckling under the force, so we need them to be fairly rigid. The early messy work out the way, time for a quick cleanup. So while I'm making the bodies from scratch, the heads are another matter, and I found what I think are 3 very good model kits for good analogues for their head. They're not perfect matches, and one of them is not really a match at all, but I think it's really fancy, and I think it'll look really good on them, so I'm going with it. However, I can afford these in no small part thanks to the fact that this video is sponsored by Creative Assembly, the makers of Total War Warhammer. So if you do want to pick up the new DLC for yourself, you can use the link in the description for a discount. Brilliant. We're only making 6 models. So we're using Illyrian Reavers for the horse-headed Oceanids, Griffins for the bird-headed ones, and a dragon for the Sea Elemental. Having extracted those 6 heads from the kits, the rest can go in the bin. Since I've gone with the more decorated sorts of horses here, I am going to trim away some of the details because some of them just aren't going to feel relevant here. They don't need reins if they don't have a rider. It doesn't make any sense, but I'm going to keep their horsey hat on. I don't know horse words, so horsey hat is what you're going to get. But anyway, it's quite easy, just trim them away, and a lot of it can be done quite roughly because we're going to be sculpting them into the bodies anyway, so there'll be a lot of, a lot of opportunity to smooth this stuff out. So I size up all the heads and the bodies, so that way I can see which heads are going to match which, and then I make final adjustments to make sure that they're actually going to stick together properly. Now it's time to get out the milliput, which is a great little putty. It's a 2-part putty. You mix the two together, and it'll start to set. But it takes a couple hours, so you have some time to work with it. And I'm going to be working with it with a bunch of tools. I never know what I'm going to use, so I always just empty kind of all of my sculpting tools out of my desk. So whenever I need something of a particular shape or size or whatever, I can just grab at it and it's there. I also make sure I have some water next to me as well. This is really good for wetting a finger and then smoothing out the milliput, because it is water soluble, and so it will also be good for cleaning your tools as well. I think the most useful thing though when working with milliput is actually Vaseline, which is petroleum jelly, I think is the non-branded version of it. But anyway, yeah, petroleum jelly. You can work this into the clay if you can get the bloody canister open, and it'll help soften up the milliput. It'll make it a lot smoother, and it'll actually extend the working time you have for it. If it's starting to get a bit hard, you can basically knead some of the jelly into it, and it'll soften it up again, so you can continue to work with it for longer. Really handy. So I recommend you get one of those really easy to open tubs, and then also remember that you did have that in your crafting supplies. That's great. So this first stage of sculpting is just going to be to basically make the foundation of our model. I don't want to do all of the sculpting yet because I'll be working it too much and I don't want to squash what we've made so far. Despite all the processing, it is still likely to get squashed if we're, really trying to work clay into gaps and things. So we're just going to put enough clay to stick the heads onto the models, add some basic shape, and then we're going to wait for it to cure. However, it is worth noting that it's going to be much easier to cut away at the cured milliput than it is to cut away at more of the plastic once this is all connected. So I'm actually going to remove more horse from our horses where applicable to make sure that we get them into the best spot possible. So you can see this eagle head. It only has the cured stuff on, holding it in place, and now that that's got a solid foundation, I can then add all of the additional details. And it is an eagle head. It's from a griffin, but griffins have eagle heads. They don't have griffin heads, they have eagle heads and tiger bodies. But seeing how these bodies are made of water, I want there to be a good blend between the head and the body, so I am going to be sculpting in some feather patterns loosely into the neck, with more definition at the top and less as I go down. So that way it'll look like it's just flowing into the water body. And a further detail that requires some actual sculpting is the head tail of the sea elemental. So it's quite easy just to make this little nub, but it's supposed to mirror the sort of spiral vortex look that the bodies have. At least it's, fairly similar, I think. So that's what I'm going for. So I make this little nub, sort of figure out where I'm going to put it, make sure it's the right size. Then I'm going to roll some milliput into a very long sausage, which I can wrap around that nub to create that spiral. Once it's blended in, it should look quite similar to the bodies. Though I also want to make sure that it's going to stick to the back of it really securely, so I'm actually going to drill a hole into the back of the head so I can put in some armature wire that I can stick the nub over the top of. I'm going to put some super glue in there too. It will stick to the not quite cured milliput, and as the milliput dries, it'll be a really good connection. But of course, before it cures, I blend it in as best I can around the edges. I can do further blending later with additional milliput, it's okay. But I also repose it because I want it to be a more dynamic pose. I don't want it just sticking out straight out the back of his head. Poor thing, he looked really silly. What would the Oceanids think? Any remaining mill part from any step gets turned into these little spiky sausages. But later, but not quite that later, our miller part has all cured, so now we need to prime our models for the 100th time. We're going to be painting them all over. Having the model all one colour will help us determine if there are any sort of issues with sculpting at all, if there are any big cracks that we couldn't tell because it was, between different colours of material or something. So this will help unify it and get an idea if we're done. And I think we are. Good. And so with all the sculpting done, it's now time to smooth out all of the work that we did previously and actually get rid of a lot of the coats of paint that we put on before. We are going to sand these edges smooth so we can get those nice watery effects rather than a bunch of papier-mâché paper crinkly bits. Okay, so this all sands really well. All of these materials sand well, except cling film, but if you've sanded that far down, you've gone wrong. So don't do that. Also making sure to only use the side of a file, so that way I'm not poking holes in the model, because that wouldn't be good. But also you'll notice that the model actually looks rougher now as we're sanding through different layers. So the rougher that the model is at any point, the rougher it's going to look once we have sanded it, even though we know that it's physically a lot smoother. So that's why you want that unified colour in the previous step, so you can get rid of these illusions, basically. And once I've sanded them all, I actually give them a little wipe down with a wet paper towel, so that way all that dust doesn't cause issues later. So I bought a few cheap plastic tubs that are about the right size to fit our models in, and I'm going to size them up for casting a mould of them, which is where this was leading. Eventually. Once I've decided where they're all going to go, I then cut away the loose cling film on the bottom of the base, so that way I can use glue gun glue to stick the base to a bunch of wooden battens, so I can create a kind of scaffolding. Essentially I'm making the sprues. Okay, these are the sprues for our model kit. Once they're all attached, we can hang them in the box to see if there are any problems. So obviously we're going to be pouring resin into the top of the mould, which will be the bottoms of the models, and it can't go down and then back up around a corner. It can't go around a U-bend. And so that's why I'm going to basically do what Warhammer does and make a sprue. And rather than make it out of whatever the heck they make it out of, I'm going to make it out of sprue, which should give me the exact same results. Okay, so I've hit a bit of a snag. So these are my silicone rubber, like 2-part silicone rubber mold making things. Either one of these will fit happily in this container, which means that the contents of these bottles are not going to fill this container. These are different brands. I have no idea if they're the same kind of silicone rubber, so I have no idea if they're compatible. So what I need to do is I need to make a divider. But obviously I need to basically have one lot of silicone in one side and then the rest in the other, if I'm going to do them both. Which means I need to make a divider that will not let a single drop of silicone leak, because if any of it leaks from one side, then the whole thing is going to drain. This is going to get stressful. So we've got to make this divider work. So card, that's the most resilient material of all time, right? Yes. So I use a container as a rough stencil, so that way I can just cut out something that's the same size as the container. It's a no-brainer, really. So what I end up doing, because it doesn't quite fit, it was always going to be a rough fit, I end up just cutting off more than I need to, and then sticking it to another piece of card, where I have one card pressed against one wall, the other card pressed against the other. When it's stuck together, you're fine. And it's fine because the actual seal is going to be sealant. Clues in the name, really. So this stuff is sort of a nightmare. It sticks to everything, which I guess is the point of it. And once it dries, it won't stick to a thing. Nothing will stick to it, including more silicone rubber. So once this is cured, we can pour liquid silicone into this cavity, and it won't stick to that. Though I do realise I can afford to make this partition even more snug, and it shouldn't affect the models. So I add a offcut of foam board into one side as well, just to try and fill up more space, so that way I don't need as much silicone rubber to fill that void. So I use some more silicone to stick that to the sides, which is actually a little bit stupid because silicone sealant requires air to get to it for it to cure, whereas the 2-part stuff that we're going to be using for the mold doesn't need air to cure. Right? That's why it's in 2 parts. One part cures the other. It's the same reason why we're not using silicone sealant to create the mold in the first place. Instead, we're using this two-part stuff, which, as you can see, you just mix 1 to 1, and so I'm going to pour that out into 2 separate vessels. That way you know you've poured out an equal amount of both, and then you can pour 1 cup into the other, and I end up actually pouring it back into the other one as well, so that way I can pick up the residue there, and also it means that no matter which cup it is, they'll both just have like rubber that can cure, because they have both parts in both cups, so it's just rubber that's cured rather than the gross half stuff that is a nightmare to clean. So yeah, use both cups, and then it's easier to clean. So I'm pouring the rubber onto the flat of a tongue depressor that is held at sort of 45 degrees into the container, as that will help avoid us getting any bubbles. And of course you do want to pour gently. I did go a bit fast, so the tide of rubber coming in will push the mold around, so you know you do want to do it gently so you can make sure you're not having to readjust the position, because that again will encourage the formation of bubbles, which you really don't want to do. Or perhaps maybe you just want to stick everything down, you know, maybe I should have just attached the rod on either side of the container so it couldn't shift. Because it is shifting a lot. You know what I'm realizing here? Our models float. Our models are floating, they're hollow, they're full of air, they're balloons. They are rising like the bubbles. Obviously bubbles rise, that's kind of the point. You want the bubbles to rise out of the thing. If you have made a bubble and you're trying to cast a mold of a bubble, that's going to rise. We've made a horrible mistake. Why didn't I tie this down? Oh dear God. It was at this point I had to move the cameras out of the way and then just do everything I could to salvage this. So I managed to clamp down the battens, so all was safe. It wasn't floating away anymore. And I also had to stop the cardboard from buckling and a few other things. Morale was pretty low. Right. So, this is what we got. So I was going to say lots of things, but now I don't know what to say. Because I'm still kind of in shock, or panic, or maybe it's relief. I think it'll depend on how this turns out. But currently, I don't know if this is going to make it, because it turns out, as I was fearing, but thought, no. We've taken all the precaution. Right, there's definitely enough in these bottles to fill this. There was not. So I had to use some of the other brand. I don't know if that is going to mix right. So I just had to sort of fill it and then just poke a stick around in it to try and mix up what I could. So if it doesn't mix completely, at least hopefully it'll, you know, intersect in a way that'll bind it together. And hopefully it'll cure. I don't really know. I'm very worried. But also it means that I have used probably too much of these now to fill my other mold. So I probably can't fill the water elemental either. So basically I just need to find a local supplier, like tomorrow, and hope that I can get it cast and then do everything else in time, if I can find a local supplier. I have no idea who would stock it. Nobody stocked it. I was on the phone for 2 hours. This is not a bit, okay? I don't want to make drama, I want to make Oceanids. So, yeah, I'm terrified. Unfortunately, at this point, all I could do was wait till the next day to see if that mold was a success. And I had to, sadly, say goodbye to the idea of making a mold for the sea elemental, because there was no time to get more rubber delivered. Look at that. Look at how that's gripping. Okay, I mean, that's just gonna tear. Okay, you know what? Actually, that is pretty good. So it turns out most of my fears at this point were unwarranted. I'm able to actually remove everything quite happily from the container. However, it turns out that the silicone sealant didn't cure in the back, because obviously it didn't, which is why it leaked so much, because, you know, it needed oxygen. So, my bad. So to actually make the mold a mold, we need to take out the original models so that we can have those cavities available to us to pour resin into to create the models that we actually want. And so that involves doing 1,000 little cuts so we can make essentially two flaps, right? We'll have one piece of rubber still, but it'll have one flap for half of the model, and then on the other side will be the other flap with the other. So we need to just cut straight down the middle, basically cutting around, up and around each model until we can just pull the models out and then push the rubber back together. Now, this is incredibly difficult because it's very dark in the recesses of these cavities, so actually trying to see where you're cutting is quite difficult, especially when you're trying to get the camera and the lights and your eyesight and the knife all into the same tiny gap that you're having to sort of prise apart with a single hand. It's, oh, it took a while. It took a while. Then I gave my resin a lovely warm bath. It needs to be warm when you mix it up. I think it'll help it flow better, I don't really know. And it's time to mix the resin. Same stuff applies, except, you know, give it a lovely bath, and then you mix it. This stuff is 2-to-1. The proportions can change depending on what product you're using, so just check the packaging, and you can't go wrong. I mean, I read the packaging and everything's gone perfectly well so far. So on a technical level, on a sort of, you know, scientific level, I don't really know why this works, if it's like surface tension or something, but I found this is really useful in the past. I like to paint the resin inside the mold in places that I want to make sure the sort of, you know, the detail is retained. It seems to really help preventing bubbles from forming in those places and just sort of ruining half of your cast. But at the very least, it can't hurt, so I'm just going to do it. And then close the mold, stick it back into its container, and start pouring that resin. I then agitate the mold to try and make sure that the resin is getting into all the little bits and all the bubbles are going to be coming out the top. And then I realised that the mold is sort of coming apart sideways, and that I forgot to put on gloves again. And then I remember the last time I did this, I wrapped the mold in rubber bands so this wouldn't happen. So I then do that, but in a panic this time, as is tradition for every step involved in making Oceanids apparently. So while the mold sits on a shelf for a couple of days with the resin to dry, that's right, couple of days, couple of very stressful days, I get on with some other aspects of this build. So some of the resin is still in this tub that I had mixed for that resin pour. It has now been sat, I think, for a day as of this point, so it started to firm up quite a lot. But I'm going to use it to muck up a bunch of cups, which might seem a little strange, but you'll see why eventually. Also, say goodbye to that brush. That brush is dead. Poor brush. I also make a whole other mold. Dig out all of the inside to then fill it with resin too. But now the day has arrived to see if our Oceanids had cast properly. Tacky! I need to get gloves for this. Okay, let's try that again. Oh my word, I think this has worked out great. Ooh. Oh my god. Look at this guy. Wow. Okay, these came out better than I was expecting. So all this excess resin that's holding all the models together, that's known as flash. That's basically the material that gets between the two halves of a mold. You'll know mold lines from plastic kits, right? You always have to remove mold lines. That's essentially flash, but like only a tiny little bit of it. This is extreme. So I'm using nail scissors to cut each model separate from each other, and then I'm going to tidy up the models like I would any other model. You can use all the same tools that you would for a plastic kit. However, resin will stay flexible for a little while after it's essentially finished cures. This is a 2-day curing time resin, but it's still a bit bendy, and we're going to be making use of the fact that resin remains a bit bendy for a while. So, yeah, it's going to help us finish the build. So sometimes you're going to want to mold things separately and then stick them together. It's almost like a model kit or something. So you remember those little sausages that I made out of the spare Miller putt? I then added a bunch of other kind of noise onto the surface of them using a mixture of modelling paste and PVA glue. And now that I've cast those beautiful clear resin details are going to be great for the back of these creatures' heads, because if I'd attached those before I made the mould, then bubbles would have easily gotten into those little tendrils and we probably wouldn't be able to get good results from that at all. So, did it as a separate mould. And the beauty of this is that I used a quicker curing resin, so I can always make another batch if these didn't turn out very well. So it's not really a problem. I don't even need these to turn out particularly well because I've not made them for a particular purpose. I just made a billion of a random size and shape, and I'm just going to see where they fit. And so now I have several of these sprues with these lovely crystal tendrils on them. So I can cut them free, tidy them up, remove all the flash, and then just cut the end at a bit of an angle that I want it to attach to the model from, so I can just get a nice shape to it, have it come off at an angle that fits the pose. And once I've dry fitted it and I'm happy, I can then add a dab of UV resin, and then I can hold it in place and hit it with a UV torch. This is the same stuff used in nail art, so it cures really quickly. So of course I want to make them nice and blue and vibrant, but I also don't want to remove that wonderful transparency that we've got going on. So I'm using only contrast paints and a wash. So we're using contrast Frostheart, contrast Pilar Glacier, contrast Talisar Blue, and shade Tyron Blue. So I started by painting them all quite pale with a sort of watered down mixture of Pilar Glacier and contrast Frostheart. I just sort of mixed and matched them a bit over the models to add some sort of variance to it, but it all just made them look quite pale, just sort of stained them a bit blue, which is exactly what I was after. And then I used Talisar Blue, which is a much darker blue, just in a strip on the underside of the spines. So this could be refraction or possibly just shadow because the water isn't entirely clear. Whatever the case, any water jet or anything is going to be darker on the bottom. And so you always want to make sure you accentuate that. And frankly, it's going to look a lot more natural even looking at it from above because it's going to give it a great sense of depth. It's going to look like deep water. It's going to be very intense and it'll fit the scale much better. Now we demuck the mucked up cups by giving them a little crinkle. And now all the cured resin will easily just snap off the side of the cup. And we can just pull it out and then we'll have a bunch of amazing splash effects. So I'm taking a length of this stuff. That's, a whole sort of way around the cup. And I'm going to cut it in half, so we have one flat side and one that is splashy looking. And they'll look a lot more splashy if I paint them with that same pale blue contrast paint. And I paint a whole bunch of them. And while those are drying, I use the same UV resin to glue the models onto the bases, which currently are just bases covered in nothing but Stirland mud. I then use this weird thimble with a sponge on the end. I don't exactly know what to call it. But it's really good for stippling, so I start stippling on white onto the spines of these creatures to make it look a bit more foamy. I also use the same technique to highlight some of the details on the faces, so that way it looks like any sharp point of the creature is where it's starting to foam up a bit and froth. And I do the same for our splash effects. Using our UV resin again, I anchor one end of our splash effect onto the body, and then I'm going to spile it around, gluing it with the UV resin as I go. This does get quite fiddly, but before long I realise actually making it kind of rough and ready, it helps make it look random and interesting, so I stopped worrying too much about it. After using all the same steps as I have described, I slowly build up more and more colour on them and make them look a lot more vibrant. But of course they're only one colour, so they look still kind of boring. They don't look vibrant when they're next to each other. They'll look much more vibrant when they're next to a complementary colour. So I'm going to flock the bases. I mean, they need grass on the bases, right? But the whole thing is really going to come together once they have flocked bases, I'm sure. So that was going to be the final step. But this guy, yeah, that's right, this guy. He used to be a lot taller, but I chopped sort of the bottom couple centimetres off him, so he'd be a more similar height to the rest. He was towering above them, and I didn't like that. And so I actually used some Ard Coat, which is Games Workshop's varnish, on that offcut, and I love how it looks. So unfortunately that means I will be having to varnish all of our Oceanids, but I think it really, just you wait till the glamour shots. You won't have to wait long though, because they're now Thank you so much for watching. I have enjoyed this project so much. The highs and the lows, it's been a roller coaster, and I hope you guys have enjoyed watching me undertake this project. It's been an absolute blast, and it was only thanks to our sponsor, Creative Assembly. Go check out Tides of Torment, the link is in the description, if you want to get yourself a cheeky little discount. Brilliant. Subscribe for more content on this channel, and also if you wanted to see Tides of Torment in action, I am playing it over on my gaming channel as well, which is either linked in the description or it's the collaborator for this video if I can figure out how that feature works on YouTube. So either way, should be easy enough to find. Thanks again. Take care, guys.